With my talk, I basically want to do three things. I want to discuss this concept of usable pasts, what it can mean, how it's being used, where are the problems in using it, based on a literature review that I've done about usable pasts looking at very different fields. That's number one. The second thing, I want to give you some sort of practical illustrations of what usable pasts can mean applied to Berlin's infrastructure. So there's something sort of tangible to get your head around, to give you an idea of what we're doing based on some earlier research that I did about usable pasts. And then thirdly, I want to introduce you to the project of past-proofing infrastructure futures, basically in terms of trying to address some of the limitations, both of the literature review, but also of some of my early research on usable pasts. That's the kind of setup for the project, okay? And as a reminder, what we actually did on the project we'll come to later, so that the exciting bit there. So yeah, why history? Why history? In addressing contemporary challenges, past experiences very rarely get accorded the sort of potential for being a valuable resource in dealing with those. So many political responses to the multiple crises we face today are actually all about craving the new and ditching the old. And I've deliberately selected three very different kinds of policy arenas to illustrate that. And the one on the bottom is from the high-tech strategy of the German government, where it's all about innovation. And innovation is the yardstick of your success to be able to navigate through the multiple challenges we're facing now. On the bottom of right is as an illustration from the transition towns movement, and illustrates really clearly how a bright green future is simply rolled out over the old grey past. You simply cover it up, yeah? And on the top right, you see Fridays for Future calling for a system transformation now. And I think a lot of commentators, as part of the problem, a lot of the commentators see the past as the problem rather than part of the solution. So there's often very little sense of how far the past can actually be inspirational and help us dealing with some of the problems we're facing today. And this also applies to infrastructures as well. I've just picked a couple of fairly recent books about infrastructure policy, infrastructure planning, looking at the futures for infrastructures. And they're all about future-proofing infrastructures. So making infrastructures fit for the present, from UNEP and also by Linda Samuels. And I've just included this Linda Samuels, a great book, very entertaining, really worth reading. And she comes up with these 11 requisites of next generation infrastructure. And I have no dispute at all with any of the 11. They're really great. The problem is the underlying assumption in the whole piece, the whole book, is that these requisites are all new. Yeah? The infrastructure has never been multifunctional. It's never been public, it's never been visible and so on. And yet I know from just doing research on one city, Berlin, I could list you all sorts of examples about infrastructure in the past being multifunctional, public, visible, socially productive, and so on. So there's a real blind spot in a lot of this literature out there. And this is reflected in the work of some historians who do take this on head on and do try to make their own historical work very relevant to the present day and to the future. And this is a lovely quote by David Edgerton from his very famous book, The Shock of the Old, where he says, present visions of the future display a startling, unself-conscious lack of originality. And I love that sort of unself-conscious. We think we're so cool. We think we're so innovative. We don't even realize we're not innovative. We talk ourselves into thinking that. So I think in a lot of the futures debates, not like history is not regarded at all in futures debate, but history and the past are often seen in very specific ways, which are very limited. And I've just listed 4 examples here. In one way, the history has taught us it's about highlighting a system obduracy. So the kind of path dependency is seen as a problem. The history here is the millstone around your neck you have to get rid of, yeah? It's part of the way it's treated in futures debates. Secondly, history can be used to justify a particular preferred future. So it's like a kind of cherry picking, the particular kind of past that fits your narrative in a particular way, rather than looking at it more generally. A third argument is to argue for continuity. We've always done it this way. Human ingenuity has always got us out of the mess. So, why bother, looking into the past and stuff? We'll sort it out somehow. Or very differently, to alarm, to alarm with frightening analogies, particularly in the last few years now, frightening analogies about comparisons with the more recent past, which actually often has a debilitating effect rather than an empowering effect. Okay? And so in a lot of these things, a lot of the way these futurists think, they miss the capacity of history to inspire, to critique, to provoke and excite. And that's what I want to be talking about today. And Tony Judd, who's a very prominent historian, did an interview just before he died, actually, saying we must learn how to make a better world out of usable pasts rather than dreaming of infinite futures. Also a lovely quote there. And here the term usable pasts falls. So what about these usable pasts? Why usable pasts? Well, a lot of you, particularly the historians in the room, will say, oh, hang on, whilst many historians do not want to engage with the present, let alone the future, there is quite a tradition with applied history, also with public history, of engaging, bringing history to bear with policymakers, with wider publics, and so on. And what I think is quite nice about the usable past concept, in a way, it combines the benefits of the two. So applied history is about speaking to power in a way, doing a lot of policy advice to policymakers. Public history, as the name implies, is about extending the range of people who do history and reaching out to wider publics and doing that kind of thing. Usable pasts has been used a lot. It's had a real hype in the last 15 years or so, as I've seen in the literature review, but it's also worth knowing that it also has a rather long history. And the term was actually coined famously by an American cultural critic called Van Wyck Brooks in this piece on creating a usable past. And he was interested in stimulating American literature after the First World War with stuff from the 19th century. So looking back to the 19th century for inspirational work. And I've introduced this quote of his, which is lovely and florid. The past is an inexhaustible storehouse of apt attitudes and adaptable ideals. It opens of itself at the touch of desire. It yields up now this treasure, now that, to anyone who comes to it armed with a capacity for personal choices. And okay, he's a literary critic, so he's allowed to write in those kind of ways. But I think the interesting thing here is looking for positive examples from the past. And that's what you see in the early generation usable past scholarship, is looking for positive examples, inspirational ideas. So in the progressive era, intellectuals were looking to the past to break with this national heroic tradition of American history. And in the 1960s, 1970s, a lot of the social movements, protest movements, were looking back to earlier times of immigrant histories, Black histories, anti-colonial histories, worker histories as inspiration in the 60s and 70s. But it's only really in the 1980s that it's broken out from this sort of US focus there. It's become more of a global phenomenon, looking at usable past in history, but also relevant to the present day. And I did a literature research, quite a comprehensive one, and identified around 280 publications, books, articles, and so on, that related to usable pasts from Scopus and Google Scholar. And what was quite interesting is, first of all, as you can see here, a lot of different disciplines are working with this concept of usable past, and not just historians. Okay, so you do have military historians looking at the analogies, the Second World War, analogies of the Vietnam War, and so on. You have historians of technology, for example, looking at pre-motorized forms of mobility as a way of informing the mobility transition today. Yeah, or you have memory studies scholars who are looking at the way that individuals and communities are drawing on certain national or individual or family narratives of way of dealing with their own crises, and so on and so forth. And what was quite interesting for this literature review is to see more or less half of the ones I identified were actually from non-historians, okay, which is a kind of interesting issue. Because of this disciplinary breadth, it is not a huge surprise that there's no general consensus on what usable pasts actually are. And I really struggle to find a definition. I have not found a decent, solid definition of what a usable past is, which is amazing, 280 words. And so here is a couple of examples of the kind of thing we're talking about. A retrospective reconstruction to serve the needs of the present. Okay. A set of historical reference with the potential to shape efforts at addressing contemporary challenges, more or less the same idea. So I actually came up with my own definition, which I applied to infrastructure, which I wrote a couple of years ago, as the enrollment and critical appraisal, note, of knowledge about the past by not only by researchers, policymakers, business leaders, citizens, and all the rest, to help address current and future challenges. And this raises, of course, a whole lot of questions about which pasts are usable, for whom, to what ends, what kinds of usable paths can be identified, and how can we identify and mobilize them? And these are real core questions, I think, sort of working with usable paths. And to give you an idea of sort of where to look for them and a way of categorizing them, I did originally, a couple of years ago, I came up with this initial typology that I just want to give you an idea of. And then give some illustrations from Berlin. So I kept either embedded paths is one kind of usable paths. So the kind of legacies of established structures that can enable and constrain options in the future. Then there are adapted pasts. So these are processes of reconfiguring infrastructure in the past to meet changing circumstances. There are parallel paths where you have, let's say, technologies, infrastructures that run in parallel to ones that are already more dominant, hegemonic ones that are already out there. Futured pasts, which is another way of talking about socio-technical imaginaries, something we'll be familiar with, but from the past that can continue to frame the present. And then discarded pasts, ones that were deliberately dropped for various political reasons, and looking at their re-emergence. I'm going to quickly run you through some examples. I'm aware this is very general at the moment. I'm showing you these examples because these are the examples I showed to our first stakeholder workshop to give people in Berlin an idea of what do we actually mean by usable paths. So the legacies, one example would be West Berlin as an electricity island. So the legacies today are in terms of redundant energy infrastructure following reunification. We have a large district heating network in West Berlin thanks to this electricity island during the Cold War. We have a heavy reliance on fossil fuels, impeding decarbonization today, so that's a big problem. But also in a non-material sense, we have a kind of cultural of energy, urban energy autarky, which is making regional energy cooperation really difficult. Okay. A second example, repurposing a street water pump is an example of adapted pasts. We'll come back to this later, but this technology is really important because it's gone through many different functions, and we still have over 2,000 of these pumps in Berlin, and they've adapted to different needs, and they're still there. We use them today for watering trees, climate-induced drought, but also as a backup emergency water supply for the future. Parallel pasts. Here we have parallel to the kind of centralized wastewater, rainwater disposal system. We have actually had quite a tradition of rainwater retention and reuse in Berlin. We now have an organization called the Rainwater Agency, which is pushing this in a big way. But there is actually this history, and it's important to you see that as a kind of parallel path to the big dominant large technical system we had, not only since the 80s and 90s, but even back to before the First World War. Futured pasts. An example here is a bit of hydraulic hubris around expansionist urban imaginaries. So the graph you see on the bottom right left is a prediction that Berlin's population will become 7.5 million by 1954 and 12 million by 2000. Ouch. And the response was from the water utility people to say, well, then we need to import lots of water from afar. We need to have lots of interbasin water transfers in order to make this possible. Didn't happen, of course, but the same idea came back in 1990, when you may recall a similar kind of euphoria about what would happen to Berlin after reunification. And then I came with my last example of discarded pasts, the emergence, disappearance, and re-emergence of sewage gas. And this was actually used a lot in the late 1920s from sewage treatment plants, and applications were used afterwards by the Nazis. It was dropped after the Second World War. And then the 2000s, when we started using sewage gas, the water utility was praising it as a brand new technology without any reference to these kind of historical pasts there. So those are some illustrations. I'm going to zoom back out now to this literature analysis I did. I refined it for this more detailed work to 77 works that work actively with the usable pasts concept, particularly relating to using it for the futures and presents. And I've analyzed some of the purposes of usable past research, identify myself trying to categorize what different purposes it put to. One is tracing the historical roots of contemporary problems. So past decisions, past choices, how were they made? How do they frame how we think today, and so on. A second sort of body of scholarship is about promoting group identities. A lot of work done into usable past, looking at post-Soviet, post-colonial nation states who've drawn on previous times, pre-colonial, pre-Soviet times of their histories in order to build up their national self-identity, but also at local community level. Thirdly, to reveal alternative histories. So in other words, to challenge hegemonic narratives, looking at alternative histories, forgotten or silenced pasts, whether it's about resistance in the past, whether it's about Black histories or alternative technologies or whatever. And finally, to actually engage with wider publics, another ambition of some of the literature in usable pasts. Now, I think it's fair to say that the early scholarship on usable past embraced the concept more or less uncritically. Yeah, that usable past is something of great benefit to us all. More recent scholarship has been more critical. So, and I've systematized here in my literature review some of the main risks involved in using past in this way. One is obviously a positional bias on the part of the historian or the person who's mobilizing these pasts in terms of their own worldviews, their own selectivity, and so on. A second risk is using the past as a model, particularly if you take a historical analogy and use it too literally, you're going to run into problems. So rather than using it creatively, using it literally. Presentism is the problem of where you start backtracking from the present to the past, where you get very much framed by a presentist way of looking at things. I'm going to move on quite fast and I can't go into this in any more detail. Factionalism is more about how people are more abusing pasts rather than using them. So they're using them for a particular faction, particular political interest that you have to be aware of course, including academics as well. Conformity is the other way around, where usable past is actually used to create some kind of consensual worldview that actually can be exclusive of minority opinions or whatever, has also been criticized in the literature. And finally, the so-called Western gaze, because a lot of the scholarship on usable past up to date draws very heavily on scientific methods, examples, public debates from the Euro-American world, basically. So what's necessary here is to draw some consequences to avoid the dichotomy between the historian and the non-historians. There's all sorts of interesting ambivalences in there to be played. We also have to acknowledge that usable past can be negative as well as positive, and they can be ambivalent. And teasing out those ambivalences is really, really worthwhile, as we'll see. Then thirdly, we need to recognize how these usable pasts can be contested, divisive and exclusive. Yeah, we're getting away from this notion of consensual ideas. So finally, maybe here, how do pasts get rendered? How do they get mobilized? How do they get rendered usable in this literature? And it's quite extraordinary. There's very little of the work that I've analyzed actually goes to the trouble of explaining how do you actually mobilize past that might be usable. So here's a quote here. The idea of a usable past is now firmly established, but its transition into practical action and tangible outcomes is yet to be realized. So a lot of the literature on usable past is all about analysis and reflection and how to narrate usable past. It's very little about how to engage with potential users of the usable past themselves. Yeah. And so how can they be mobilized effectively, with whom and for what kind of futures? And that leads us very much into the logic behind this project, because that was the idea behind it, to have a project that was not about historians telling what usable pasts are, but creating a forum platform for exploring usable pasts for different kinds of people. And we deliberately, provocatively called it past proofing infrastructure futures, to play with the future proofing idea that people expect. Okay. And basically, it's been going on since December 2023. We're going to be concluding at the end of February. And the objective, I thought I'd give you a quote from the project proposal, to generate knowledge on how the past can be mobilized critically and productively to help shape transformative pathways for urban infrastructure systems of energy and water, using Berlin as an empirical case study and site for knowledge dissemination. Pauline, I don't think I would use the word dissemination. We wouldn't use that now, would we? No, definitely not. Well, you live and learn. I live and learn anyway, because it'd be more like co-creation now is more accurate what we've done. So we've done it conceptually. That's what I was talking about, exploring this notion of usable paths. Methodologically, looking at modes of mobilizing usable paths, and we'll come to that in the second presentation. And then empirically, obviously, around Berlin's infrastructure history. And we've got a motto for the project, which actually works better in German than in English. Wait, it doesn't often happen that way around. Yeah, nicht nur die Geschichte nachdenken, sondern mit der Geschichte umdenken. You cannot translate that really well into English with the nachdenken and umdenken. So there you go. And we have a great project team, a very small project team on this, doing this. And we're quite deliberately, I'm an urban historian, an infrastructure historian, working together with Pauline, who's a science communicator. And this combination that's made this project possible, full stop. Yeah. And together we've had some fantastic support from our student assistants, first Hannah and now Fernanda for the last few months. And of course, a project of this kind cannot work as a purely academic project. So we've had from the beginning a lot of practitioners from Berlin involved who are signed up partners and who have been invited to all the events and have attended lots of the events and activities we've done. Just in case you don't know these symbols that they stand for, InfraLab Berlin is a platform for infrastructure providers in the city of Berlin. Okay, it's like an umbrella organization within which these 6 utilities work. 4 of them are relevant to our particular topic. So the BEV is responsible for electricity provision and heating, Berliner Wasserbetriebe for water supply and sanitation, Gazag for gas supply, and the Stromnetz Berlin for the electricity grid. In addition to the utilities, we have museums on board. So the City Museum of Berlin, Stadtmuseum Berlin, and also the Technology Museum here in Berlin, Deutsches Technikmuseum. And in addition, we have KWB, the Kompetenzzentrum Wasser Berlin, which is a sort of research organization which works very closely with the Berlin Water Utility. And finally, we have a great scientific advisory board. You can see here, and this is a nice lead into the panel discussion we're about to start now, who've been really, really super helpful in advising. We had 2 online and 1 in-person meeting of the scientific advisory board in the course of the 2 years, as critical friends, picking us up on problems, issues, pointing out all sorts of openings, giving ideas of what we could be doing. Really, really helpful. And yeah, I think that's a great lead-in.
Okay. So we'll start now on the last presentation in this segment before we have our coffee break. So here we go. Okay. So we wanted to highlight and showcase our project process. So we built this presentation and wanted to show what was planned, then what happened, and who actually cared. And we wanted to show that this process was a lot more than following different steps, but there was a constant adaptation to both emerging and disappearing opportunities. So a lot, it was like a pipe. So there was twists and turns, it was invisible, but we're hoping at the end there was some kind of network that came as a whole. So this co-creative process that we've been talking about and discussing and should keep discussing was central to the way that we structured the project. And it all began in earnest with a stakeholder meeting that we had in 2024. So right at the beginning of the project. And this was an important first step, and we had stakeholders from all the different utilities and museums that Tim highlighted in the slides were present. And we gathered here upstairs in the other room and engaged them with these 3 central questions, which were really trying to capture what kind of past is usable for you. So these 3 questions were: which challenges of today would benefit from historical knowledge? On what topics would you like to see history broadening perspectives? And where are there deficits in our understanding of Berlin's infrastructure history? So we discussed these three questions for hours, and popular issues started to emerge, including the resilience of infrastructure and response to shocks in the past, or how infrastructure was valued in past urban policy. And after this, there was a long process of compiling, combining, and contextualizing. So this process was led by Tim, where he was going back to his archival research and then going back and forth with steps of voting until we finally came to a selection of 7 themes. Do you have anything to add? Yeah, okay, great. So these 7 themes, we have 7 core themes that we then also discussed in another meeting with NGOs, kind of checking in if these also are relevant to them in their fields. And we also begun to brainstorm together methods and formats that were suitable to activate these themes. So then what happened? So we're actually going to discuss all of these 7 themes over the next minutes and really tell you what ended up happening. So the first theme that people really valued that came out in this co-creative process was rainwater retention in the city. So we began researching and planning a tour of different water retention sites, historical cases here in Berlin, and we had planned to do a walk within an art science festival. There was an artist involved, but this failed to materialize because of limited capacity. So we had to keep adapting it until it was really a very small input. And so you can see some of the things that we did find and still look at. But it did end up becoming, and there was historical input to the Academy for Spatial Research for a bid that was in for a transfer project on climate resilient sponge cities, which will be happening in 2026. So while the one thing didn't work, the other one did end up working. It was a similar case for the theme of repurposing the city's gas network. We had some plans to connect to a local art gallery, the Prater Galerie, who was doing a lot of community works on a former gas facility, but this also failed to materialize because of limits with funding and time. But a lot happened with Gazag and Berlin 21, which is an NGO. There was a session that Tim gave on transforming Berlin's gas system at the Energietage conference. And he talked about the relevance of historical transformations of Gazag. That was in May 2025. And then quite recently, so 2 months ago now, there was an excursion and a tour in the context of Berlin spart Energie, which was an action week. This event was co-hosted by Berlin 21 and Gazag. And Tim then gave some inputs on the history and the future of gas and heating systems. So for the next theme.
Okay, watch out there. Yeah, okay, the next one was dealing with crises, which is a really interesting issue that came up really powerfully in that initial stakeholder workshop. And so we realized we had to do something of a very interactive nature. It'd be important to do that, and I can talk about that in some detail. This is the interactive workshop on historical visions. And Heike has fortunately already mentioned there's this spin-off on the top left where we did a similar kind of thing with 120 engineering students as well. And also, it's interestingly, because Karina was talking about the publications, the empirical work that came out of this interactive workshop I'm going to talk about now is actually fed into an academic paper about how to deal with planetary crises. So we're playing with that. At the same time, on the right, you get this idea, we had a fantastic meeting with some security officers in the Berliner Wasserbetriebe who are there saying, we can't get our CEOs to think right about resilience. Can we use history to get them thinking about the seriousness of resilience? And Berlin's a great idea. So we had a great concept for that, but that again failed because it would need a lot of to work with a lot of politicians and be persuaded to get them on board. So again, a kind of ambivalence there. But I'll take you into the workshop in more detail now. This is a great workshop we did in June this year. And the title is Past Futures, a workshop on visualizing infrastructure visions in the past and the present. And the contemporary challenge here is very much about the multiple crises that people are facing now. and the infrastructural responses that are coming to in answering these crises, and exploring that for how past crises were dealt with infrastructure planners and infrastructure visions in the past. And we were deliberately using visual material in a very explicit way to get people thinking about history. Now, this workshop was attended by about 20 people, again, mainly from our practitioner partners, the utilities, museums, and NGOs, and so on, but also some wider people here. And this was a deliberate attempt, rather than, we had selected cases, I'd selected 3 cases, I'll talk about them shortly. Rather than present those cases, we deliberately said, no, we're not going to present them. We'll give them what we call surprise boxes, Überraschungsboxen, where there was material in these boxes for themselves to unpack and look at with all this visual material about 3 separate infrastructural visions and discussed them in those groups. And then in order to have a kind of structured discussion about the possible implications or impacts if those visions had been put into practice, which they weren't largely, we use this PESTLE analysis, and PESTLE stands for political, economic, sociocultural, technological, environmental, and legal. So getting them to structured discussions. And that's what they look like here, these hexagons you can see there. And then we had speculative visions about Berlin's infrastructures, and you'll see a couple of examples on the back there. And then there were concluding plenary session about the learnings. What does this all mean in terms of visions that are being made now for Berlin's infrastructure? So just to give you an example of the cases we were using this example of interbasin transfers from the 1920s that I referred to earlier, and about how that was a response to this vision of Berlin expanding to 7.5 million people. The example on the left is protests against building lots and lots of power stations in West Berlin, which was all part of this urban energy autarky system. And the one in the middle, we haven't talked about yet, which is about a very interesting project from 1932 about nutrient recycling that all of a sudden took on a weird political twist in the form of social control and megalomania to make it a very attractive proposition for the Nazis when they came to power after 1933. So a really interesting example that played with this ambivalence of usable past there. And here's one example of one of the PESTLE analyses. People were thinking through the impacts of a particular vision if it had gone through with the energy for West Berlin in the Kalten Krieg, and the speculative visions for rainwater management in Berlin coming up there. But I want to draw you particularly to the takeaways that came out of that workshop. There are a lot here. We've just sort of crystallized them down here. And one is that this long-term perspective of these visions, looking back at past visions, proved hugely important in identifying the sort of diverse effects, diverse implications, political, economic, ecological, and so on. And the historical cases were really useful in doing that. Also, what came up, that this was from the feedback, this is not our opinions, we've got feedback, institutional amnesia, the fact that a lot of these schemes are unknown, even by specialists. Like the interbasin water transfer is not known. They're planning interbasin water transfers right now. And the people who are there at the meeting, I cannot believe that this was done 90 years ago and we don't know about it at all. So this institutional amnesia is really important. Historical precedents can inspire confidence for current challenges. This is a workshop about crises, and this whole workshop will show we've done crises before. We can deal with crises. We've got different crises now, of course, but Berlin's experience shows that crises can be dealt with. So it can inspire confidence. And finally, it can reveal the ideologies underpinning a lot of contemporary ways of thinking. And that example with the recycling nutrients is really good to demonstrate the real strong ideology, where a certain technical idea was picked up by the Nazis. And somebody actually said as a reference at the end, so I really valued that, because now we have the far right trying to create agendas around new eco-social policies. And this shows exactly what was happening in the 1932. So another one of the topics that came up was governance. People say you have to do something about the governance, how the utilities work with the city government and wider populace and all the rest. And it was not really concrete. So we, with the advice of the Scientific Advisory Board, thank you, they said just integrate it into one of the things, because otherwise it's too broad to deal with. That's what we did with that particular suggestion. Another suggestion was demand forecasting. I remember when this came up, I thought, oh gosh. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. And it turned out into a really exciting interactive workshop around demand forecasting because it got really, really specific about how do you do that. So we had this interactive workshop in July 25, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. A few people were there who were there, and this was entitled Zahlen, Erzählungen, Zählbares, which again doesn't translate nicely into English at all. Play on the words of numbers. It's a kind of hands-on history workshop with a lot of archive material, so less visual stuff, much more written material, correspondence, notes, and all the rest from the archives. And the contemporary challenge here was very much the uncertainties. What do you do with the growing city of Berlin? What does this mean for electricity consumption with the, and what does it mean for gas consumption as well in the future? So how do we do demand forecasts with uncertainty? And how did they do that in the past? How did they do demand forecasting in the past? Can that help us out of situations of uncertainty to understand ways of planning infrastructures in the future? So we had a smaller group this time, maybe about a dozen people altogether. The modes of mobilization here were kind of similar. One, engaging with past decision-making processes in group work with archival documents, again, with very, very little prompting by me initially. Then using a number of guiding questions, what data were they using for the demand forecast? What assumptions were they using as a basis for what they were doing and so on? Then considering the impacts of the infrastructure plans if these predictions had come true. And again, because it worked so well previously, we used the pestle analysis there. And then together we considered what the implications of this exercise for demand forecasting today, for how you do that now. And we had 4 cases this time about demand forecasting. Of course, we used a lot of graphs as well, but there was a lot of written material. One on the left, it was quite important for me to have from different political regimes. How was demand forecasting done in East Berlin, which is what you have on the left, with lots of issues about the Socialist Unity Party getting involved in steering the demand forecasting in certain ways. One on the top right from the Weimar Republic with this sort of idea of electricity is going to be a new electric city. So how do we do demand forecasting there? One on the bottom here is from West Berlin, demand forecasting for building up all these blocks of power stations to go up. And the one in the middle from the post-reunification era, demand forecasting with water consumption going up and down in very curious ways. So those were the 4 cases we looked at. And we had a fantastic artist researcher, our colleague Chris Unverzagt, who was doing this drawing as the discussions were going on. Absolutely amazing, wonderful graphic recording. So starting from the pestle, the debates from all the material that they had, the pestle analysis, and all the sort of conclusions that came out of that. And the main conclusions here, or the takeaways, were the demand forecasts, surprise, surprise, were often wrong. And they were often radically wrong and really fast within a few years. Yeah. And this was something that came out not from me, from the people there, they were saying, yeah, but the process of developing those demand forecasts was actually really, really useful. And all sorts of interesting ideas came out of that. So what the bottom line was, don't get so worked up about perfecting your models for demand forecasting, because they may well be wrong anyway. Think much more about the contexts, the conditions, and the implications of using demand forecasting for planning infrastructure systems. The second point was that a lot of infrastructural redundancies were actually produced by these forecasts, which led to a lot of excessive infrastructure being planned that actually proved really, really valuable for the urban resilience during the Cold War, which is kind of interesting in terms of infrastructural redundance there. And the final point is that they saw that in particularly the Weimar Republic, a lot of social policy objectives played a huge role in these demand forecasts in the 1920s. People said, well, we're not really talking about these kind of things now. The social dimensions of these demand forecasts often get dropped up. We're also thinking of, in terms of consumption, not in terms of social policy objectives there. So that was the third thing that came out of that. And then hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you. So then we had 2 more themes that we worked with over the course of the 2 years. The expanding the urban electricity grid was one there was a lot of initial interest, but those who were interested and who made it a popular one were not so responsive. Nonetheless, the concepts were integrated into the workshop that Tim mentioned. Then the final theme was between protest and participation. And this became a theme and a topic within our canoe trip that was already mentioned during the talk, that we had with a scientific advisory board where we canoed alongside or on the river Spree. And here are a few pictures. So from the vantage of the water, we picked up the idea of both protest and participation in these infrastructure systems that we could see paddling along. And so we wanted to also give an insight to what happened beyond this planned process. So alongside the co-creative steps and these 7 themes that we were working with, there was a lot of other emerging activities and opportunities that happened both through external interests, so people approaching us, and self-initiated. So this meant that we had to be very open and adaptive all the time. But then the question is a bit, who cares? Who is showing up? So we wanted to spend a little bit of time right now zooming into 3 examples to highlight both this contingent and dynamic process, but also who we were working with, so these audiences that we were talking to. So starting with the walking tours. So actually, this is how Tim and I started working together in 2020. Back then, we started with making workshops about the infrastructure of history here in Berlin, and it was later developed into, I don't know if you can see, into the digital tour. So there's a picture of Tim talking, and then this was developed into that. And over the past 2 years, there's been a lot of popularity, a lot of people approaching Tim for the tour, and he's been able to adapt it to reach different interdisciplinary audiences. So there's been water engineers, historians of technology, urban historians attending different conferences and workshops. And while this was happening, the idea of walking as a method also became inspiration for a lot of exploration with further movement-based methods. So we talked about the canoeing. Heike also mentioned the bike trip that we planned by the waste infrastructures. And this became something that we wanted to explore further within our project as well. So also this summer, we planned the bike trip called Cycling Legacies of Infrastructure. And we were curious of the ways in which that we could expand this walking as a method and these largely information tours that we were doing. So we were still kind of going from different places and talking to people, but we wanted to include more voices and perspectives. We were curious about opening up to more exchanges and reflections. And in particular, I was very curious about the uniqueness of cycling to spark embodied knowledge and embodied learning. So this place learning that we also talked about. So the ways in which moving through an environment, you learn about the space and place. We wanted to reach a wider audience, and this method of activation, it was very much a practice-led approach. So beginning with the practice before really knowing what's going to happen, using the practice to gather inputs and insights for further research and for further practice as well. We did ground it in some contemporary challenges. So we wanted to contextualize and provide an entry point to some broad urban water problems that we have here in Berlin. So that's why we also chose a former sewage farm to bike around. It's called Humboldt-Universität. It's in the north of Berlin. It was built in the 19th century. And Humboldt-Universität in many ways connects pasts, presents, and futures because it connects to this canalization system. And it starts to signal these path dependencies that we still have in Berlin that complicate our future and current water challenges. But the space also provides more stories to chew on because it's also had many transitions that happened over the past 100 years. So yes, it's been this sewage farm and this leach field, but it's been a lot more. Now it's a conservation and recreation area, and it was a lot of different things through political and social eras. And so it was going beyond this singular and linear story and starting to highlight this conjuncture of continuity and change that is integral to these infrastructure histories. So modes of mobilization. So as mentioned, we were exploring cycling as a method that's based loosely off walking as a method. We had a plurality of perspectives within the organization. So there was us two, as well as a data scientist and an outdoor journalist, and we created a route with different points of interest that included a museum, wildlife viewing, a water treatment facility. And also a wayfinding task to kind of break up this route. Together with the journalist and the photographer, we had this task where people then had to stop using digital navigation and find their way back to the start. So encouraging them to be open, to find a path, but also maybe get lost, to experience the landscape and question this idea of linearity. And we had a reflection task where people could share reactions and ideas, impressions. And before I share those, I mean, here's another picture of how you can see. So this was is a historical picture of a similar sewage farm, and then this is us standing in front of the sewage farm, how it looks today. So it looks drastically different, but you can still see some of the traces and see now what it looks like in the different trees that are growing. So there was a lot of takeaways from this reflection round. We don't have time to go through them right now, but just to share some of them, what was happening when we were talking, that people were noting how they were able to start to deconstruct certainties. So someone saying, you think you know it all, then you're moving and learning about the power of more narratives. Also, this idea of transcending relations. Cycling was a way to break up boundaries, to see cycles, connections, layers, connecting temporalities. So people noted how the past blends with the future and the present through the movement of the bike. It also tapped into emotions, and people even connected to childhood memories a lot through smells. This aroused speculations in some people and really highlights the potential impact that cycling can have as a method. However, it also starts again to talk about and to spark ideas about ambiguity in making infrastructure paths more usable for a wider audience, because there were academics that were part of this, but there was also non-academics. So there's teachers and people who just wanted to bike. For me, it's been less ambiguous what the impact has been, because it's become something that I've shared at a symposium in Glasgow. It's becoming part of a chapter section in a book led by Evelyn. So it's featuring more in my work. We're running out of time, but another thing that's always been happening throughout the project is a lot of panel appearances. So anyone who knows Tim knows that he's been through, especially the past year, just so many panel appearances, so many discussions, everything from conferences, climate change, social sciences, you have it. But there's also been a lot of unexpected settings and unexpected audiences here too. So this one is another picture of the ruins of a medical lecture theater. So talking to surgeons, climate scientists, museum curators, and even in pubs. So we took part in the Pint of Science, which is a global format in which mostly researchers, but also others share their insights in local bars. So I was able to present titled Back to the Past, and again, talking about contemporary water challenges in relation, actually connecting it to the sewer that was outside of the pub, to the canalization history. So from the 1800s to today. And also starting to introduce these uncomfortable and ignored histories. So maybe you can see up here within this pub is, people having a pint, and then also having, again, this plan that Tim talked about from Miga, about these uncomfortable legacies of ways in which people were acting and reacting to water and sewage.
Okay, yeah, very briefly, another thing that sort of really struck people's imagination was this street water pump, which has led to all sorts of spin-off activities around this very mundane, apparently redundant technology, that because it has different functions, it's survived and fulfilling lots of ones today. So it is in itself, as I was saying, sort of socio-material usable past. So it features in the On Water exhibition, if you happen to go there, in the Humboldt Forum, organized by the Berlin University Alliance, and the people there thought, oh yeah, that's a great story. Can you tell it? And all the different transformations it's gone through, this street water pump. I've given some specific tours about the water pump and its history for environmental groups and Falling Walls group. And I'm actually, because of the interest, I've written an article on the non-death of Berlin street water pump as an off-grid technology, in a special issue there. So again, playing to those kind of audiences. And here's a couple of pictures taken recently, and an enjoyable meeting there, and perhaps not quite so enjoyable one trying to remove groundwater in a groundwater monitoring session, trying to get at the aquatic creatures that live in our groundwater and do some research about that. So more about that in the break. We're going to finish now. We thought rather than having some sort of broad brush conclusions from the project, we thought it'd be rather nice to have some personal takeaways because we approach this project in such different ways. So these are my personal takeaways as a historian, what I think have been the strengths and what I think have been the limitations of this project. And then Pauline will give her own take on what the personal strengths and weaknesses were. So in terms of the strengths, I think what I've really loved about this project is sort of doing new forms of doing history in new forms collectively. So it's been like sort of sensitizing others to the value of history through their own analysis and their own interpretation. It's those feedback rounds where people have come up with their own stories. So usable past, in other words, is not something that's out there that needs uncovering. It's something that needs mobilizing through discussion, through reflection by multiple people. The second point is that usable pasts are kind of an oblique take on the present. Sometimes we think the past, because it's so far away, it's harder to relate to. But what's really struck me with a lot of our interactive things, it's actually, in many ways, easier to relate to because it's non-threatening to the participants. Because it's not what they're doing in their everyday work. It's something that's at a distance. Because it's at a distance, they're freer to discuss about, the history of their own organization or whatever. So that's been kind of interesting, I thought, really interesting about that. Temporal distance is actually an advantage. The next one is generating a sensitivity to time and temporality and the way in which pasts continue to frame the presence. Think about the legacies from West Berlin, its energy, but also how futures get enrolled in present. So the visions workshop was very much about futures getting drawn into the present and getting as an argumentative ploy. And then the final one is very much this surprise factor. I've loved confronting people with some of these schemes, these images, these documents that many have not known at all. Even the specialists have not known at all. And that kind of surprise factor has a sort of unsettling effect on what you think you know. So it's that kind of unfamiliarity and the novelty unsettles the sort of taken for granted ways of thinking and doing. So those are what I think are maybe the strengths. In terms of the limitations, I think there's been a lot about expectation management about here, that usable past is not about, some kind of ready-made solution will drop out of some kind of analysis of usable past. It's very much about it helps you think through some contemporary challenges rather than offering you a clear-cut way of doing things. And managing that expectation has been tricky. What I've found tricky is that some of these stakeholder requests, particularly the ones that came out of the first stakeholder workshop, actually, defied my historical knowledge. So somebody said, well, how did they do public participation, city-led public participation in the past? Give us some good examples. I've got lots of examples that they did it badly. I can't think of ones that did it well. So in a way, that sort of and that comes, there are some issues where you just have to say, I really don't know. And that brings me to my last point. I was very aware, I was the only historian on this project. So all the kind of questions of where to look for, what to source, what cases to source, was all coming back to me. So I'm very, very aware that that was a very sort of personal take on the kind of material and select kind of examples I'd chosen. So possibly it would have been good with more time and effort to reach out to other historians and say, look, they've come up with this idea, demand forecasting, what are we going to do with this? You got any ideas where we could look from? That wasn't possible in the scope of this project. So over to you.
Yes, well, what was possible were a lot of creative methods. So we talked about the visualizations, the speculation, the movement-based things. And I found these were really powerful instigators of learning with usable pasts. And these methods also hold potential to think beyond linear temporalities and singular stories, so towards these current and future challenges with a lot wider audience. I mean, it's very much at the beginning that we're starting to do this. I think we have to also reflect on that, but I think that there are a lot within these creative methods that we were experimenting with. Urban infrastructure history, from my perspective as a science communicator, really offered this approachable entry point through its very tangible everyday nature for people to learn about cities and learn about and think about sustainability. In particular, through showing how local crises were addressed in the past, this tends to empower rather than debilitate. When we consider what's happening in the popular media, what kind of frightening historical analogies are happening there. Urban history infrastructure provides something a lot more grounded that I think also, again, is a strength of the project. The limitations, so as noted, there was an underrepresentation of diverse audiences. So I think that's a critical thing that we need to take forward is, this question of usable pasts for whom. The sustained engagement of our stakeholders. I mean, we're busy, everyone else is busy. It's hard to take time in people's busy schedules and keep that going. As noted too, there's this ambiguity of impact. I think that's something that happens in a lot of co-creative and a lot of transdisciplinary projects. So that also happened with us. How are we making pasts usable? But it's also, to end on a note is that it's leading to a lot of really interesting conversations. So are people making pasts usable on their own terms in their everyday lives? Are they forming personal repositories? Or as Tim says, conduits of conductivity? These are concepts that we're still playing with and thinking about, and that we can keep discussing in the coffee break, which I believe is starting now.